The biggest mistake language learners make isn't about learning enough words, it's choosing the wrong method when learning how to speak. Because having the right method is the difference between being able to speak confidently and clearly or just being hopelessly frustrated by all the mistakes you are making when you try to communicate. And in this deep dive masterclass in learning how to speak a new language, I'm going to show you exactly how to speak without making mistakes so that you can communicate better in your day-to-day life using your new language. I'm Dr. Daniel Ash, academic, researcher and language learner, and I share methods that cut through the noise and get you fluent faster. Now, this method isn't theory or clickbait. In fact, what I'm about to share with you might surprise you, and it's what I've learned by using evidence-based methods on myself to learn a new language rapidly and with as few speaking errors as possible. Now, learning to speak without mistakes requires us to deal with a few critical problems that exist in current language learning methods. And to deal with these, I have developed what I call the pattern reset method. And once you understand how to use it, everything else falls into place. But before I reveal the two game-changing parts of this method, we need to understand what we're up against. Now, let me make this simple. Most of the time, you don't even know you're making mistakes when you speak. You talk and you think you're doing okay, but without realizing it, you've actually been saying the wrong words and sentences the whole time. And here's the kicker. The longer you keep doing it, the worse it gets. Those errors get fossilized. They get embedded in your brain. And here's the really annoying part. What you've actually done is trained your brain to make mistakes, which are then very difficult to unpick. In fact, the longer you've been learning, the language becomes more difficult and the problem becomes worse. And here's what people aren't telling you. Language tutors cannot solve this problem for you. I mean, sure, they can correct you and you can understand the corrections, but then when it comes time to speak, you will make the exact same mistakes again. And those mistakes become embedded deeper. And it's then a spiral that is then really difficult to stop. But here is the exciting part, because the fact that your brain embeds patterns of language, even if they're wrong, allows us to reverse engineer this fact and use it to speak without making mistakes. And in this masterclass, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. So here's what's coming up in part one of the language reset method. Firstly, we're going to talk about how you can start right now to use your existing learning materials in a completely different way to automatically retrain your brain and stop making mistakes when you speak. And in doing so, you will learn how to speak correctly and communicate better. But part one is just the foundation of this method, because in part two, I'm going to reveal the unique strategy that amplifies the pattern reset method to compound your gains in speaking so that you can produce the language yourself error-free. And by the time we get to part two, you're going to realize how much opportunity there is when you're working on your own with limited money or time to speak more like a native and less like somebody who's just been stuck in a classroom for 2 years. Now, here's the reality. Most language learners are frightened of speaking. Not because they lack the vocabulary, but because they are not using the principles of the pattern reset method that we're going to learn together in this video. Because when you use this method, you will be more confident that what comes out of your mouth is error-free, and it's as simple as that. Now, stick with me, because what you're about to learn took me weeks to figure out as I was struggling to speak a new language, but this method could save you months and even years of frustration and pain. So the way it works is that you start off by implementing part one of the method first, and the part one is this. You take some of the material that you've already been learning in your daily practice, so that might be like a podcast that you've been listening to or reading, and maybe shadowing it as well. And in fact, shadowing, by the way, is speaking at the same time as listening and reading as well. And just as a quick aside, if you want to know how to use that technique effectively to massively improve your ability to use a new language, then please check out my other videos where I talk about the conjugate method of language learning, which helps you rapidly gain fluency. Now, for part one, once you've grabbed your podcast, you take the transcript of that podcast and you put it into AI. Now, it doesn't matter whether it's ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever system you're using. You simply ask the AI to take that transcript and to use the words and the grammar style to create a 200-word story based on that podcast topic. Now, this is the really cool bit, because what it will do is put the podcast content into a completely new story, but using words and grammar you already know. Now, it doesn't matter whether you are a beginner, intermediate, or advanced learner, because whichever podcast transcript you give the AI, it will produce a text that is at the right level of difficulty for you. And that's the beauty of part one of this method. It adjusts to your level automatically. Beginner in, beginner out, advanced in, advanced out. So then once you have that new story, you then start using that story to practice your speaking by having conversations with AI using that story as a basis. You ask it questions, it asks you questions, and you use that transcript in your target language, the language you're learning, as a scaffolding, as a kind of support for having that conversation. Now, this isn't the whole method. This is just the first part. And it's when we get to part two that you will amplify your gains. But for now, as you use that story to speak with the AI, you will find that you can then start using parts of that sentence in the story and stitching them together into new sentences as you speak. And as the AI speaks to you, it will naturally start to do the same. And so it's like riding a bike for the first time. You know, you put your training wheels on the back so you can get going. And this is exactly what you're doing in part one of this method by using highly structured conversations with familiar content. Now, you might be like, Daniel, I've heard this all before. I just repeat different variations of patterns of words I know, and it improves my ability to speak more complex sentences. And you might think this isn't new information, but this is where most learners stop and why they get stuck as well. And this is where part two comes in, because part two, yes, part one will help you to recognize new ways of using the language, but it won't fully activate your ability to speak in the real time like part two will. And so here's the secret. Part two of this method is once you've read and spoken all those new sentences using AI to practice your speaking with those stories you've created, you now flip it round. And instead of reading the words in your target language as you speak to AI, you put those transcripts away, and you now only have in front of you the same story, but written in your native language, the language you speak every day. Now, this is where the real gains come, because you repeat the speaking exercise you did in part one, which is speaking to AI about that story. But this time, because you're reading your native language as a prompt instead of reading the story in the language you are learning, you begin activating the specific brain circuits that allow you to understand and produce the language yourself in real conversations. You are no longer simply reading the words off a page and repeating that as you see it. Instead, you're now reading the story in your native language, but your brain is translating and piecing together the words into sentences with the correct structure in real time as you speak. And because you have the native language translation in front of you as your set of training wheels, your error rate when you speak dramatically reduces. But here is the exciting flip that makes the whole method worth doing. Because when you go back to speak in your target language in real conversations and you then make a mistake, the new patterns that you have laid down in your brain using this method will allow you to hear that mistake with your own ears, possibly for the first time in your life. It will just feel off. You will sense that it doesn't feel or sound right. And then you will automatically self-correct your speaking. No tutor needed, no advice required. Your brain will do it all by itself because of the work you did using the pattern reset method. And that's the power of this approach, which is actually part of the larger evidence-based method I've been developing, which is called the conjugate method of language learning. And I talk about this approach in my other videos. So if you want to break, fossilize mistakes, and finally speak with confidence, subscribe. I'll be sharing more parts of this method very soon.